The golden light of the late afternoon spilled through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the walls of the small house in Savannah, Georgia. The room, once filled with the lively chatter of family dinners and the clinking of silverware, now felt heavy with silence. Margaret Wells, 78, sat at the same kitchen table where countless memories had been made. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, rested on the photo in her trembling hands. It was a picture of Arthur, her late husband, tall, proud, and smiling in his uniform from a time that seemed as distant as another life. She could almost hear his voice in the quiet of the room, the echo of laughter that used to fill these walls. Her gaze lingered on the photograph for a long while, her fingers brushing the edges of the frame as if trying to feel his presence once more. The soft rustle of the curtains in the breeze was the only sound in the room, the house around her now still, almost lifeless. Margaret let out a slow breath, the weight of the years pressing down on her chest. She felt the hollow ache of loss, a reminder that her days of shared moments, of warmth and joy, were long gone. The house, once a symbol of a life well lived, now stood as a lonely monument to time's passing. The soft hum of the ceiling fan above was the only thing that kept the air moving, yet it only seemed to emphasize the stillness of the space. As she sat there, Margaret couldn't help but feel the sharp contrast between the life she once knew and the quiet, empty space she now occupied. The memories of Sunday dinners, of Arthur's laughter filling the house, all seemed to slip further away, leaving her here in the silence, holding on to the past with nothing but the photo of a man who had been her world. Across the room, Ava Wells, Margaret's daughter, stood with a tense air about her, dressed in a crisp navy pantsuit. Her movements were sharp and deliberate as she adjusted her handbag, her fingers trembling slightly as she clasped and unclasped the strap. Her braided hair was tightly wound into a neat bun, and the polished click of her shoes echoed softly against the tiled floor with each step she took. Ava paced back and forth, her gaze shifting restlessly from her mother to the door, her every action betraying the unease she felt. She wasn't used to being in this position, wasn't used to seeing her mother this still, this quiet. Margaret's silence hung between them like a thick fog, more oppressive than any words could have been. Ava took a breath, as though steeling herself for the conversation she knew would be difficult, and finally spoke. Her voice was soft but firm, like the first gust of wind before a storm. "Mom, I need you to start packing. We're leaving tomorrow morning." The words spilled out quickly, almost too quickly, as if they might lose their strength if she lingered on them any longer. Margaret blinked, confusion flickering in her eyes as she looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Packing? Where are we going?" Ava paused, her heart hammering in her chest as she looked away. For a moment, she couldn't bring herself to meet her mother's gaze. "Somewhere where you'll be more comfortable, a place with more support, people around." Her voice faltered, the weight of her own decision starting to sink in. "It's time, Mom." The words landed like stones, heavy and unforgiving, echoing in the silence that followed. Ava felt her breath catch, knowing what came next would change everything between them. Margaret's eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding crossing her face, but she didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was thin and fragile, almost lost in the space between them. "You're putting me in a home?" Ava's response came too quickly, a quick, defensive denial that only made the air heavier. "No, not like that," she said, her voice tight, cracking under the weight of the words she couldn't quite make sound right. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just, I think it's what's best for you, Mom. You've been alone for too long. It's not safe here anymore, and I can't be here all the time." The last word slipped out almost as an apology, as though she were asking for Margaret's forgiveness for something she didn't know how to justify. Margaret's hands, which had been resting gently on the table, tightened into fists, her knuckles white. Slowly, as if the effort was too much, she stood, her body stiff with the shock of what she was hearing. The edges of the table dug into her palms, and she gripped it for balance, as though the room might tip over beneath her. She didn't look at her daughter. Her voice, when it came, was brittle, barely above a whisper. "So I'm just a burden now, is that it?" The words felt like jagged rocks in her mouth, too heavy to speak, too painful to hear. Ava flinched, but Margaret didn't see it. She couldn't. The silence between them stretched thick and heavy, thick as molasses, suffocating in its stillness. Ava's words were meant to soothe, to ease the hurt, but they only made the wound deeper. "You're not a burden," Ava said, her voice quivering now, though she tried to mask it with determination. "I'm doing this because I care. I want you to be okay." But Margaret heard the lie in her daughter's voice, felt it in the way Ava's words trembled. The deep, aching void between them was growing wider with each passing second, until all Margaret could do was shake her head, her heart feeling like it was being torn in two. "I raised you. I gave up everything to give you a future," Margaret whispered, her words weighted with years of sacrifice. "And now, this is how you repay me? By taking me away from the only home I've known?" The argument, as it always did between them, ended not in shouting, but in a deep, suffocating silence. Margaret didn't wait for her daughter's next words, didn't care about the justifications that were sure to come. She turned away from Ava, her shoulders hunched under the weight of the quiet. With slow, deliberate steps, she made her way to the bedroom, the sanctuary that had once been a space of comfort, now a room full of memories and echoes of the past. She opened the old suitcase, its edges worn and softened with time, and began the ritual of packing, though the movement felt mechanical, almost numb. Each item she placed into the suitcase seemed to carry the weight of her entire life. The shawl she had worn to Arthur's funeral, the old Bible with its frayed edges and pages that had long since yellowed with age, the small ceramic bird that Ava had made for her when she was 7. It felt like she was preparing for the end, for something final. Her hands trembled as she folded her clothes, neatly and methodically, as though this task, this preparation for whatever was coming, was the only thing she could control. As she moved through the process, the memories came in waves, crashing over her. The house, once full of the laughter and joy of her youth, now felt like a distant dream. Arthur's absence was a constant ache in her chest, a reminder that she had spent so many years giving, sacrificing, never asking for anything in return. And now, here she was, no longer the strong, independent woman she had once been. Her knees ached at night, her joints stiff with age, but it wasn't just her body that was wearing down. It was her heart. Margaret had never been one to cry, but as she carefully packed the small items that had once filled her home with meaning, the tears came anyway. They rolled down her cheeks silently, the only sound the soft rustling of clothes being folded, the heavy, aching silence in the air. That night, sleep came in fragments, each dream slipping through her fingers like sand, only to be replaced by the sharp sting of waking. The house around her felt colder somehow, emptier, as though the walls themselves mourned the departure of the life they had once sheltered. Margaret tossed and turned in the bed, the weight of the conversation with Ava pressing down on her chest like an iron hand. The word burden echoed endlessly in her mind, a cruel whisper she couldn't shake. She tried to imagine what it would be like in a place without the ghosts of the past, without the constant reminders of Arthur's absence, but the thought brought no comfort. In the early morning hours, when the first light of dawn barely crept through the curtains, Margaret awoke. The gray light was enough to pull her from the depths of a restless sleep, but it was not enough to soften the hollow ache that had taken root in her heart. She lay there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the house, the stillness that had replaced the sounds of life. The walls, once filled with noise and warmth, now seemed distant, cold, as though they had no more stories to tell her. She sat up slowly, her back stiff with the weight of the years, and looked around the room one last time. Everything was as it had always been, familiar, comforting, but now it felt foreign, like a life that no longer belonged to her. Ava was already in the kitchen when Margaret emerged, her movements careful and quiet, as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile balance between them. She was packing a small bag of her own, her eyes downcast as she worked, her hands moving mechanically, as though she too were trying to avoid the conversation they both knew was coming. Ava turned at the sound of Margaret's footsteps, and for a brief moment their eyes met. But there was no apology in Ava's gaze, no softness, only a reflection of the weight they both carried, one unspoken, one too heavy to lift. Margaret's voice broke the silence, a whisper barely louder than the soft hum of the morning. So we leave today. It wasn't a question, it was a fact. The suitcase lay on the bed, ready for the journey neither of them wanted to make. The morning was cold, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Ava moved through the house with a quiet urgency, her footsteps light but determined, as though the act of preparing for the day could somehow soften the sharp edges of the truth they both knew. Margaret, silent and still, sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, her mind far away. The house, once so full of life, now felt like a shell, an empty echo of a time that was slipping away. And there was no way to stop it. As Ava gathered the last of the bags and placed them by the door, Margaret watched her daughter, but it felt as though she were seeing a stranger, someone who had come to take away not just her belongings, but the very essence of the life she had built. When the time came, Ava helped her into the car, her movements gentle, but there was an edge to her touch, a tenderness that couldn't quite hide the tension. Margaret barely noticed the car's movement as they drove away. The world outside passed in a blur, the landscape rolling past like an endless film, the trees and houses melting into one another. The road stretched out before them, long and empty, the same road they had traveled so many times together, yet now it felt like they were heading toward some unknown end. Ova tried to speak, tried to fill the silence with words, but they came out flat, hollow, as though the car itself were absorbing the sound. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the passing world, her gaze distant, lost in thoughts too painful to face. Hours slipped by like that, each mile marking another step away from the home that had been hers for so long. The quiet hum of the tires against the asphalt was the only sound that kept her tethered to the present. When the car finally turned off the main road onto a narrow gravel path, Margaret tensed, a knot forming in her stomach. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice strained, though she barely recognized the words as her own. Ava's voice came back softly, but there was something in it, something she couldn't place. "You'll see, Mom." The words felt strange, a promise wrapped in uncertainty. The car slowed, and Margaret's breath caught as the landscape shifted around them. As the car turned off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path, a sudden unease settled in Margaret's chest, tight and unyielding. The tires crunched beneath them, the sound so sharp against the stillness that it seemed to echo in the quiet of her mind. She glanced at Ava, her daughter's face tight with a forced smile, her hands gripping the steering wheel too hard. The landscape around them was unfamiliar, a wild, untamed stretch of trees and low hills that only deepened the sense of confusion in Margaret's heart. "Where are we?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling just a little, though she barely recognized the fear in her own tone. She hadn't meant to sound so unsettled, but the path ahead felt endless, as though they were leaving everything behind, heading into an unknown she couldn't fathom. "You'll see," Ava replied, though her voice was softer now, more distant, as if she, too, were caught in the web of uncertainty. Margaret tried to focus on the trees passing by, oak and pine, their leaves rustling in the wind, but the sight only made her feel more trapped, as if the world outside was closing in, too tight, too narrow. The car slowed even more, the wheels barely disturbing the dust of the gravel road. It was as though they were moving through time itself, each second stretching into eternity. Margaret's breath quickened as she tried to catch a glimpse of something familiar, something that could tell her where they were headed. Then, as they rounded a bend, something appeared ahead, a house. But it wasn't just any house. The moment Margaret saw it, her breath caught in her throat, a wave of recognition crashing over her with a force she wasn't prepared for. The house was familiar, impossibly familiar. It stood at the end of the gravel path, nestled beside a calm, shimmering lake, its soft blue shutters and wide porch with rocking chairs looking like something straight out of a forgotten dream. Flower beds, bursting with marigolds in color, framed the house as though it had been placed there by some tender hand, making it look as though it had been waiting for her all along. Margaret's heart raced as she stared at it, unable to speak. This house, this dream, had once belonged to her and Arthur, a dream they had built together. The memory of it hit her like a wave, sweeping over her with the force of lost time. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. Ava turned to her, tears already welling in her eyes. It's real, Mom. I found the property. I used your old sketches to restore it. I bought it back. The words barely registered in Margaret's stunned mind as she stumbled out of the car, her hands shaking as she gripped the door for support. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This was the house, the dream that had slipped through her fingers so many years ago, now standing before her like a forgotten promise, waiting to be claimed. Margaret stood frozen, her hands still gripping the car door, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she looked at the house before her. The reality of it was overwhelming, too much for her to take in at once. The house had once been a dream, a vision she and Arthur had shared, a plan for their future together that had slipped away when money had run thin. She had never expected to see it again. Certainly not like this, not so real, so vivid. Her eyes scanned the house, its soft blue shutters, the wide porch with the rocking chairs gently swaying in the breeze, and the flower beds bursting with marigolds. It all felt like a dream, but it was no dream. It was real. Ava stood beside her, her face flushed with emotion, tears glistening in her eyes. It's real, Mom, she said, her voice breaking with the weight of the confession. I found the original property listing. I bought it back. I used your old sketches to restore it. I wanted to give it back to you. Margaret turned slowly to face her daughter, her eyes narrowing as she tried to grasp the enormity of what she was hearing. This house, this dream, was back in her life. After all these years, after everything she had given up, Ava had brought it back. Margaret's heart ached as she stared at her daughter, the truth of her actions settling heavily in the space between them. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "But why, Ava? Why do this for me?" Ava stepped closer, placing her hands gently on her mother's. "Because you gave up everything for me. You sold your dream so I could have mine. I wanted to give a piece of it back to you." The words sank in like warm honey, slowly filling the cracks in Margaret's heart, healing wounds she hadn't even known were still there. She looked back at the house, her breath catching in her throat. The years of sacrifice, the loneliness, the quiet acceptance of her fate, all of it seemed to wash away in that moment. It wasn't just a house, it was a second chance, a dream brought back to life. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt hope stir inside her, fragile but alive. Margaret walked through the house slowly, her fingers trailing across the furniture, her heart pounding with each step. Every corner held memories. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to echo with the laughter of a lifelong past. She wandered through the rooms as though discovering them all over again, but this time they felt different. They felt alive. The smell of wood polish and fresh linens filled the air, a comforting, earthy scent that seemed to embrace her, wrapping her in the warmth of forgotten days. In the living room, a hand-woven quilt lay draped across the couch, the colors soft and familiar, just as Arthur had always liked them. Margaret ran her hand over the fabric, the texture grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. On the mantel above the fireplace, a framed picture caught her eye. It was Arthur, holding baby Ava in his arms, the proud grin on his face, so real, so vivid, it might as well have been yesterday. Margaret's throat tightened as she looked at the picture, her mind flooded with memories of those days when life had been full, when she and Arthur had made plans, built dreams. She had never imagined she would be standing here alone, without him, without their shared hopes for a future. And yet here she was, in a home that held everything they had once dreamed of. She moved to the back bedroom, where a rocking chair sat by the window, facing the lake. The soft light of the afternoon poured in, casting long, golden shadows across the floor. Margaret touched the chair gently, her fingers grazing the smooth wood, and for a moment she felt something inside her stir, a sense of peace, of belonging, of something that had been lost but was now found. She looked out over the lake, the water sparkling in the sunlight, and the memories of Arthur and their dreams seemed to return to her all at once. She turned to Ava, standing quietly behind her, her presence like a steady anchor. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I thought you didn't want me anymore." Ava stepped closer, her voice breaking. "I've always wanted you, Mom. I just didn't know how to show it until now." Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she opened her arms wide, and Ava rushed into them, holding her tightly. The space between them, once so vast, finally closed, And for the first time in years, Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long: love, connection, home. In the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself blooming again, a slow and gentle transformation that crept into every corner of her life. She planted flowers in the garden, just as she and Arthur had planned so many years ago, her hands sinking into the earth with a renewed sense of purpose. The vibrant marigolds and lilies that began to sprout from the soil seemed to echo the rebirth she felt inside. She baked bread in the kitchen, the warm, yeasty smell filling the house, mingling with the soft jazz she played on the radio. The melodies floated through the rooms, weaving their way into the quiet corners of the house, and Margaret would sit on the porch with Ava in the evenings, watching the sky stretch into hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the lake. The world seemed to slow down in those moments, and in the gentle light of dusk, Margaret felt the weight of years lift off her shoulders. Neighbors began to visit, some familiar faces from the past, others new, their voices and laughter filling the house with a warmth it had been missing for so long. One of them brought a scrapbook of the town's history, and as Margaret flipped through its pages, she found photos of herself and Arthur from decades ago, smiling at a 4th of July picnic, their lives so full of hope and promise. It was as if time had folded back on itself, bringing her face to face with the woman she had once been, the woman who dreamed of this very life. Ava visited every weekend, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with a notebook filled with ideas for small renovations, but most of all, she brought stories and laughter. Margaret listened to her daughter's plans, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. The distance that had once separated them seemed to vanish, replaced by a closeness that filled the space between them, solid and enduring. One morning, while planting lavender by the porch, Margaret turned to Ava, her hands dirt-streaked but her eyes bright. "I used to think dreams died when you gave them up," she said, her voice soft, as if speaking a secret. "But maybe some dreams just wait for the right time to bloom." Ava smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "Or maybe they bloom when someone loves you enough to bring them back to life." Together they stood side by side, mother and daughter, the lake shimmering behind them, the scent of lavender in the air. Margaret looked out at the calm water, then up at the sky. "I'm not going to a nursing home, am I?" she asked, her voice light with the joy she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. Ava laughed, taking her hand. "You're already home, Mom." And for the first time in years, Margaret believed it.